Off our story series, which is usually we do through the month of July. So we're going to pause from our Luke series, going through the Gospel of Luke. We'll pick back up in August and going through there. But we're kicking off stories. So next week, you want to come back, register online again. We're going to be having our very own Brandy Cleaver is going to be sharing a story. And how many of you know Juan and Kristen Duran? They have the two twin boys and Samuel. He's from Dominican Republic, and they have an amazing story they're going to be sharing. And then we have Jason Forsman, hopefully coming in a few weeks. And then we have John Drular is going to be sharing. It's going to be a great series, and so you don't want to miss it. But today we have Andy and Amy Peterson all the way from Iowa. Now, my wife, Julie, is from Des Moines, which is actually a city, a decent-sized city. She's not a farm girl, but these two are definitely farm people. So I told them, please leave your chickens in the car, because this is wind up. But guys, give it up one more time for Andy and Amy Peterson.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Am I on? This is good. So, Pastor Jeremy told us that we would be telling our story, and the series was going to be called Stories. And so I took a few minutes, and I just went online. I was like, okay, so what makes an interesting story? And Mr. Google Pants is really helpful with that. So I looked it up, and I discovered that a good story has 5 basic elements. A setting. So our story is set in Des Moines and Omaha and rural Iowa, and it has characters. And I'll let you figure out a little bit about who the characters are in our story as we go. And then a good story has a conflict, challenge that has to be overcome, and that conflict ends with a resolution, and there's a plot. It starts with a setup where we tee up the conflict, and then tension rises, and it builds, it crescendos, and then there's a climax, and then the story is resolved, and it's a happy ending, and everybody lives happily ever after. And so Amy is going to go ahead and start off our story and tee things up for us.
All right, so you all know my sister and what an amazing woman she is. And so I grew up in the same home, and So I identified myself as a good person, a really good church kid. In the church, every moment the doors were open, as many times as my parents would let me. And, I knew that that's not what got me to heaven. That's not how I got saved. But my actions and the way that I lived, that's how I acted. So I felt like, I needed to just keep going to church and keep being involved. So that's what I did. So that's kind of my foundation of where I started as a good church kid. And then I hit, late 20s. We're officially adults. We're supposed to have an identified path that we're headed down, and I felt like I was living my dream. Like I was married, I had 2 kids, I lived in a city, but I had a little urban farm, a big garden. We had chickens in our backyard, which I know you guys can't do here, but it's amazing. You should try it if you go somewhere else, or if you don't live in Wyandotte. But, so then my husband started feeling like God wanted him to go somewhere else. I was like, no, that's not okay. I'm happy where I'm at. This is where I grew up. This is where all my family at least comes back to. My parents lived there, so everybody siblings all came back to Des Moines. So if I wanted to see them without having to travel a bunch, I needed to be in Des Moines. So, I mean, this went on, like I got to that point where I wanted to know God better, but I felt like I was where I knew I was where I was comfortable, and that's where I wanted to be. Very much like Michael talked about during worship. So God just kept using circumstances, using Andy's job, just things going on in our relationship, and opened crazy doors. Like, I didn't feel like I heard God's voice personally. I knew other people did, that God did speak to people, but I didn't think he spoke to me. And so I was just, kind of trying to read the signs. Like, okay, God, I see that you have put this burden on Andy's heart, so maybe that's a sign. And then I see that you've opened this door, so maybe that's a sign. And so finally, there were enough signs that I was like, okay, I will fill out this application, and we will just see what happens. And within 24 hours of me filling out this application, we had an interview. We were scheduled for a second interview, and we were headed to Boys Town, Nebraska, to work with at-risk youth. And that was really terrifying to my very comfortable in the church, in the church heart. Like, my heart was super comfortable in the church. And outside of that, I was really uncomfortable. But I said, okay, I see that God is opening up all these doors, and for the first time I feel like he's communicating with me directly. And so that's what I want. That's what I'm eager to know him in that way. So I said, okay, I will go. Okay.
So ours. Hello? So if you push the power button for a long time, it turns off. There we go. I got it figured out. So our story is teed up. You may have pictured there's a little bit of conflict coming. We have some characters. We have Amy, Andy, and we have God. And a good story has a good guy and a bad guy, a protagonist and an antagonist. And in this story, it's going to get a little confusing. We all know, of course, God should be the protagonist, the good guy. But, well, let's just see what happens. Amy's gonna continue the story, and you're gonna hear as tension begins to build until we get to a climax.
Okay, so we come to Boys Town. We start this job, and in this job, we are both employed, and we're living in a home with 8 boys. So we have our own separate little apartment that's in the home. So I do have a place to go that is just mine. But I'm taking 2 little kids into this environment of boys who are, let's say it nicely, disrespectful. And they didn't really care how good I was, or how many times I had been to church, or how many worship songs I had sung or led, or any of that stuff. They just didn't care, and they were mean, and I was not used to people being mean to me because I was a very good person, and I didn't like it. And so I started to wonder, okay, God, I feel like there's something you haven't given me. Like there's something missing. Because you know who I am. You know who you created me to be. You know that I'm quiet and introverted and I don't like conflict at all. I can't handle it. And so, like, okay, I'm gonna trust you that you're gonna give me this missing piece I must be missing because I need help. So then, a few months later, we stay. Doesn't get better. My heart's not any better, not feeling any more peace. In fact, it's getting much worse. And I'm starting to wonder, God, do you know me? Do you know who I am? Like, I don't think if you really knew me, that you would have put me here. Or maybe you do know me, but you really don't love me like I thought you did. And for me to admit that I thought God didn't love me was crushing. To be able to say to myself that I doubt what I've learned as a child, things that are written in the Bible, that I would question those, that I truly wasn't sure, that I didn't know if God loved me. I didn't know if He knew my heart, the deepest parts of me. And it was terrifying. I felt like all of my foundation was just completely ripped out from under me. And as the months progressed and we continued to stay. Hello? Okay. As the months progressed, I just said, you know what? I really don't think that God knows me, and I'm pretty sure that He doesn't love me, or at least He doesn't know how to show love in a way that I can understand. I don't relate to this God that I thought I had served my whole life. And so it happened to be that we came on a family vacation to this place called Wyandotte and visited my sister and brother-in-law and their beautiful family and their fairly new church plant. And we had been here for a while. My brother had come, so we were all together as a family, and I just felt so much peace. And I was like, oh, yes, this is what life is supposed to feel like. And the day before, or like the night before we were supposed to leave, I just felt anxiety building. And I knew that I had to go back. I had to go back to this life that I hated, to a God I didn't trust. And I just felt completely abandoned, alone, and didn't know what to do. So, fighting with my husband, harping at my kids, we get in the car and we head home. And the closer that we get, the deeper and deeper and darker my heart and my mind get. And at one point, we're driving past miles and miles of cornfields, and I just looked out the window and thought, what would happen if I just opened the door? I wouldn't have to go back. And at the time, it didn't seem like a significant thought. It didn't seem unrealistic, because I was very, very dark. And later, once we got back, finally I just told my husband, I was like, I need help. I need somebody to talk to that is not at Boys Town, that doesn't think Boys Town is amazing and wonderful and helping all these kids. I know all that, but I still hate it. So I found a counselor at a church in town, and just as I started to express things and told her about my experience on the way home from Michigan, and began to see that I needed real help, more significant help, and that Andy and I together needed help. And so I began to get a little bit forceful with my demands on my husband and what we needed, and whether or not this family teaching thing was really for us.
So, so we're transitioning. Come to a climax. Kind of a big thing. The story's pretty bleak. Our good guy, protagonist of our story, he's moved from certainty, which says, I've never really heard God's voice, but I know He loves me, and I'll follow these open doors because He sustains the peace around me, to a place where she's uncertain. Does God love me? If He did, would He allow my peaceful world to be so disturbed?
Is it going side to side?
No. Back to certainty, which says, I know God doesn't know me or love me. If He did, He wouldn't have allowed my peace to be shaken. And finally ending with this ultimate climax, this point of decision. God doesn't know me. He doesn't love me, so what's the point of doing what He wants? What's the point of living? Who really cares? What's funny is, funny is probably not the right word. What's interesting is that, yes, she grew up in church, and she had all of this structure around her, but she ended at the same place a lot of people who've never set foot in church have that. And the reality is this, that when God wants to break into your world, the world you're in gets shaken. And that world could be traumatic and hard and dark, and you've developed tools that help you survive it. That world can be wonderful and full of light and all of these wonderful people, and you don't realize how you haven't developed anything on the inside. And when the pressure on the outside gets strong, what's inside collapses. And the world you thought you had starts to fall apart. And so I don't want you to feel like if your story isn't one of where you grew up in church and everything was perfect, and then it's not perfect, that this story doesn't apply. Because the reality is when God shows up, when you encounter Him for real, everything changes. And you're notice, and I suspect that you're beginning to notice that it's really confusing. Because Amy thinks that she's the good guy. She's the protagonist of our story, and it appears that God and possibly her husband are the bad guy in this story. And I think it's also important to take a moment here and talk about how we as humans, we respond when our world is falling apart, when we're in crisis, when we're under stress, when we've gotten bad news, when someone's angry with us. We run, we fight, or we hide. And I think emotions are a beautiful thing. Some of you probably think that they're a terrifying thing. And that's okay. You know, just baggage to be discarded. They get in the way, they weigh us down, they keep us from getting where we want to go sometimes. But I've started to understand that emotion, it's energy, and it's the energy that moves us and motivates us to go in a direction. Love moves us to do a lot of wonderful things. But these emotions that move us to fight, to run, or to hide, it's usually one of these three: fear, shame, or anger. And we might fight in anger, we might fight in shame, we might fight in fear. It's the emotion that motivates us. The action may be the same. It can be kind of tricky and complicated to figure ourselves out sometimes. I didn't know it at the time going through this, but I've since learned that I'm prone to fighting in shame. I feel broken and flawed, so I have to fight hard to fix what's broken in me so that I'm not broken anymore. And that's what going to Boys Town really was for me. I found something to do that I was good at. I think I'd been either fired from or left 6, 7, maybe 8 sales jobs in the 5 years before I went to Boys Town. The longest I'd held a job before I came to Boys Town was 3 years, and that was working at a daycare center from the time I was 15 to 18, and my aunt ran it, so she didn't fire me. So like there was some stuff in me that was like, do I have what it takes to be a man and to support a family? I don't know. and I needed to feel like I could do life, and I found something that I was good at and that I thought I could do that with, and it seemed like the easiest way in was to drag my family there and to give this thing a try. And I was so focused on fighting and holding back my shame that I didn't see how angry she was at God and how hard she fought not to be angry at me for dragging her there. Because Amy, she doesn't fight in anger, she hides in anger. And that's tricky. Because until she feels like she has permission to be angry, something's bad enough that it's okay to be angry, that this response would make sense to most people, we're going to just kind of try to blend in and not make waves. Maintain peace. Peace is really important to Amy, and I did. I took her to a place that had no peace. Working with kids that are from trauma, creating trauma everywhere they go, and needing a lot of empathy and a lot of compassion, and I didn't notice. I was just completely unaware of my wife, and so our story comes to this climax, and the love of my life comes to me and she says, "I'm done. I'm leaving. You can come with me if you want to, or you can stay." And it was in that moment that I fully realized the tension between the loves of my life. Myself and feeling like a success as a man, which is important to a man, and my family. And I thank God that I that I get things sometimes, eventually. I wrote it here. I'm a smart man, and I get things eventually. And I knew that my career, my plans were not as important to me as my marriage and my family. So we made the decision to run. At that point, me in shame, she in anger. And by the new year, we were done, and we'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment that, with the house payment we were still paying in Des Moines, we couldn't afford. And over that course of that year, the rest of the wheels of our whole life fell off. And we ended up losing the house. And we were both pretty low. And that's where our story turns. And we were introduced almost miraculously to a couple of people who, the only way I know how to describe it, had spent enough time in the presence of love that everywhere they went, they just distributed love and grace. And Amy's going to introduce the first of them. We'll call these supporting characters.
So like Andy said, it was totally miraculous. We found an inner healing ministry, and the way we found them was through free preschool. Our son, Aiden, was, I don't remember, 3, 4, something like that. And I was looking for preschool, but he knew too much to get into the public school preschool. They didn't have enough spaces, so he had to take a test. If you know so much, then you don't get to go in. So I was looking for a preschool, and we had no money. So a friend told me about this church that was, actually it wasn't the church, but it was a ministry that was doing preschool at a church, and it was free. And so we signed me up. So we went, we checked it out, and we met 2 women who who were running this preschool, and I was just shocked, basically. I had never met anyone like that. They were kind of strange in the way they talked. Like, it was just, yeah, you're totally fine. Whatever you need, it doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter if you can pay anything. And we're all gonna ask the Lord what He wants to do in your lives. And they were super excited to be able to invest in us as parents, as well as our son. And we were like, well, okay, all right, let's look into this. We'll pray about it. And so we went to visit the school and take a tour, and found out that they actually do all ages. It's not just preschool, but preschool is what usually people find. And so it was kind of like a homeschool co-op sort of thing. So ended up, we put both of our kids at this school, and parents were encouraged to volunteer and participate as much as possible. So we did, and I was there every morning. They started every morning with worship, and then at one point I wrote an email because I was frustrated about some piece of something, I don't remember. And so I went to the leaders and was just expressing, frustration, and at somehow, somewhere along the way, I said something about I just get so angry, and with the most love that I have ever experienced anyone correct me with, they said, honey, I think you need to have some healing, and the Lord just loves you so much. He wants you to be whole, and you don't have to deal with anger. I was like, no, you don't know me. Yes, I do. That is a reality in my life, and I've been struggling with it forever, and I work very hard not to let anybody see it. And so eventually I did meet with one of the ladies and just started praying, and the very first session, she handed me a CD. It was called The 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice. And as soon as I looked at it, I thought it looked really hokey, and I was like, not sure about this. So I took it home, put it in the CD player, and was listening it, I think, in the car or something, I don't know, and very skeptical, incredibly skeptical, because I don't hear from God. Other people do. Like, honestly, Jeremy is probably the first person that I knew that heard from God on a regular basis. And I honestly didn't know him all that well, because we've never lived together for long periods of time. And anyways, so as I'm listening to this, and the man's talking, and he's telling all these things, and how everybody can hear from God, that was the first time I had ever heard someone say that so clearly, that everyone can hear from God personally. I was like, but I don't. So what does that mean? And so going through this process, the very first time we had to do an exercise of, he called it two-way journaling, asking the Lord a question and just listening. And write down whatever comes to your mind first. Just write it down. And then there are filters you can put it through. Like, is this my own thoughts? Is this from the enemy? Is this from God? And then just trusting that if this is a loving voice that lines up with the character of who God is, I can be confident in saying, God spoke to me. And the very first time that happened, I fell apart. Oh my goodness. Like I am right now, good grief. I did not know that God loved me so much. And I did not know that He wanted to tell me personally that I didn't have to go to a prophet and I didn't have to go to a pastor, that I could hear it on my own, in my own heart. And guess what? The heart changes so fast when you hear directly from the Father speaking directly to your heart.
So Amy meets these two ladies, and I am incredibly skeptical. I gotta understand, at Boys Town, we were expected to attend the two churches on campus, and we had two options. So we grew up in this theological. We grew up in the same way of thinking and the same way of perceiving God, and every church we'd ever attended aligned with that. And so it was like jumping from one cookie cutter into the next. And then we went to Boys Town, and the two churches we attended, we could either attend the Catholic church or the Protestant church, and frankly, both of them were pretty traditional in nature, and they were not what we were used to. And I began even to question a little bit whether or not I knew what it was to hear from God, because there were times when I would think I was hearing from God in a context or in a space that didn't make sense to me. Like at Catholic church, I found myself like, oh my God, I wish I could take communion. This is so cool. And I was like, that's weird. Like I didn't understand where that was coming from. And at the same time, I would be at the Protestant church where they're trying to be more contemporary, and I'd be like, something's missing here. And I couldn't figure out what it was. I couldn't put my finger on it. And that should have been the closest to what I was used to, and it was the furthest. And I realized what was missing when we went through this experience, because at the same time that she starts going through this process, and her heart begins to change, like she said, so fast. It was like I had a new wife, and I didn't know where she came from. And the grace and the love that she began to exhibit towards me and towards sin issues or struggles that I'd had for a long time, that I was like, this is different. I need to know what's going on here, because it didn't fit with what I was familiar with, and so I go to meet the guy who created this ministry. And I'm going to do a few sessions myself and see what this is all about. And it's either my first or second time being there, and I'm running 15 minutes late. I just aside, the way that God's put me together, I don't perceive time as everyone else does. Time is relative to where I'm at and what I'm doing in the moment and how focused I am on it. And it can go faster, it can go slow, and I just don't perceive the passage of time well. It's a thing that I'm working on. But so if we start going long, that's probably why. Anyway, I show up 15 minutes late, and I'm really used to showing up late, and I'm used to feeling very small when I show up late, and expressing that I feel small so that people will deal less harshly with me because I'm late. And so I knew he had been waiting there for at least 15 minutes for me to show up. And I walk in, and I'm apologizing profusely for being late, trying to make it make sense why I'm late when there's no excuse. And he looks at me and he just says, you know what? It's okay. I had a really awesome time with Jesus while I waited for you. And it was just such a blessing that you were late. Thank you. And I about fell apart. I started to cry. I had never been treated so frankly in the middle of my mess, in the middle of my flaws. And he just showed me grace and love in a way that I was so unused to. Like pastors and ministers and teachers. I was raised in the home of one. I went to college to be one. We can get into this place of we're constantly trying to improve and help others improve, and there's always some kind of feedback or something to correct or change or some way to shape or to disciple or to train up, and that's not necessarily bad. But in that moment, he was able to perceive in his connection with God that wasn't what I needed. And and he was able to just let love and grace be in charge in that moment. And I was ready to just, whatever this guy said, even if I didn't understand it, I would take it back to God until I did, because he knew something about love that I didn't understand, and I needed to understand it. And so we would call this season a season of sitting with love. First with people that showed us love, and then as they taught us, with God, who showed us love. Learning to hear God's voice was also a really big part of that for me, and I can't speak highly enough of that really hokey and kind of weird 9-hour CD series that we listened to on hearing God's voice. It was very detailed, but very good. And fast forward a couple of years, and we'd been living this experience of just basking in God's love. And I every time I would go to do, like she called it two-way journaling, I would sit down to ask God what he had to say to me today. And it was really interesting, because God would speak to Amy in pictures. Like, these pictures would burst on her mind, and she would interpret these pictures in some really awesome ways. And he always spoke to me in words. Like, I would hear words. And the only word I heard for a year and a half was, "Andy, I love you." And I would write it down in my journal. And there would be more words to it than that, but there was always the heart, always the message. "Andy, I love you. Andy, I love you. Andy, I love you." And I would be like, "Yeah, God, you love me, but what do I need to work on? How do I get better? How do I get fixed? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? I know you love me. What do I need to do to earn your love?" That's really what I was asking. I know you love me, but what do I need to do for that? There's got to be an exchange here, right? Because that's all I'd ever known. Like, I have to perform to get love. That was kind of, I know my parents would never say that that's the way things were in our house, or that's what they wanted them to be, but that's really how it felt. I had to perform to get love. And here was God just loving me, and he was not telling me what to do. And it was, frankly, it was kind of making me angry, until there was one day it clicked. It's like, oh my God, you love me. And it took like a year and a half. And I remember I was driving to work one day, and I was just like, God, I don't deserve to be loved like this. And I was trained in sales, and when I was in telephone sales, they always told me, like, smile when you're on the phone, because people can hear your smile in your voice, rather than smile on the phone, because people, you get it. And I hear God speak in my heart, and the only way I know how to describe it is I could hear him smiling. I don't know if that makes sense, but I could hear him smiling as he said, I'm telling him, God, I don't deserve your love. And he smiles and goes, I know. And there's this long pause, and I'm just like dreading what's coming next. And he goes, but you're worth it. Those words fell into my heart like a bomb. Because I'd studied scripture, I went to college for it. I knew the pain that Jesus went through. I knew all of it. A God who created everything, who made the planet. It says it was his joy to crush him. And Jesus said, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. I know, with a smile on his face, and you're worth it. I was undone. But this realization that the joy of the Lord is my strength. And you gotta ask yourself, what is the joy of the Lord? I just said it. It was the joy set before him. It was for that joy that set before him that he endured the cross. It was his joy to crush Jesus. Why for me? I am the joy of the Lord. I didn't even know what to do with that. That was, I had no grid, no framework to hang that on. And I lived into love, and I started to recognize that's my identity, that's who I am. I'm not a broken, flawed individual that just can never get it right. I am the joy of the Lord And the relationship with God was the joy set before him. The prize of that relationship is me to him and him to me. And the thing that is his joy, the relationship between he and I, is my strength. So we've come to a resolution. In a really, really short season, Jesus broke into our deep need and he brought real lasting peace to Amy. But it wasn't a peace that was connected to and anchored in her world around her, staying peaceful and calm. It was a peace that was anchored to him, and he was in her and not going anywhere. And at the same time, he brought the realization to me that resolved my shame and gave me a new identity as his son and one with him living in the earth. But the amazing thing is that there's this reversal that happened in our story. The good guy became the bad guy, and the bad guy became the good guy. God, who she thought was the bad guy, became the hero of the story, and she thought for so long was good. I'm in a good place, I'm a good person, I've got everything put together. This big aha came that I'm broken and I'm a mess. And I need a hero. What's really amazing though, is that there's another story that happened that made this whole story possible. And God, who stands outside of time, burst onto the scene 2,000 years ago as the protagonist, the good guy of his own story. But in the same way that there was a character reversal in our story, the good guy became the bad guy and the bad guy became the good guy. There's a character reversal in his story. He's dying on the cross. There's a moment where he says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" I believe that was the moment the Apostle Paul talks about when he says, "And he who knew no sin became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus." We could become the righteousness of God by living in relationship, constant connection to Christ Jesus. So he who knew no sin became the very most evil thing that was killing us. It was the evil in our story, if we have to be completely honest. And it was the evil in his, and he became the villain so that we could become one with him. He says in John, "You are in me, and I am in the Father, and the Spirit is in you." So he just takes the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and he adds us to it in this really amazing discussion that he's having with his disciples. That's really big and really deep. I don't even fully understand what all of that means. But I do know this. He became the bad guy in his own story so that we could become one with the good guy. It's changed everything for me. In the way that I think, in the way that I perceive myself, in the way I look at other people. So now the question is, where are you at in your story? Perhaps you're in the setup, you're still trying to figure out who the bad guy is and who the good guy is. You're buzzing along happily, not even sure that there's a problem or a conflict on the horizon in your life. Perhaps tension is building, you're somewhere in the middle, the conflict, moving towards the climax. You're tempted to run, you're tempted to fight, you're tempted to hide from God because you believe he's the bad guy in your story. Maybe you're shifting into a resolution. You've seen Jesus in a new way, and you're willing to consider that he could possibly be the hero of your story and the hero of his own. Maybe you're ready to stop running and come out of hiding. Stop fighting and resolve your anger or your shame or your fear. I could have you come up, we could pray, we could fill out cards, do an altar call, and that's all good stuff. But the reality is that's what started this whole mess for Amy. I've got to be honest. How many altar calls? How many prayer meetings? How many worship sets? She prayed a prayer. I prayed a prayer. We'd fill out the cards. We'd merged completely with the church. We attended. We had a great church. not unlike this one. But without learning to trust him, without getting to know him personally, without being known by him, you'll go to heaven. Sure, you can be saved. But you probably won't bring heaven to earth. You may become religious and have a lot of good systems and forms to keep you in the right place in the community and in your church and in your home. But you won't become love. And you'll learn a lot of facts and a lot of the right things to believe about God and about his love. But it's an experience in him and in his love that causes you to really know him and to be known by him. And so I'm not going to give you a card. I'm not going to ask you to come up here. I'm going to ask you to go home. And to ask him to speak to you. To show you where you are in your story and what's next. And just imagine that he'll break in. Trust that he's going to break in. There will be people that come along that help in the process. He's really good about putting things together for a willing heart that wants to really know him. He's really, really good at it. We thought we were running away from him, but we were running right into his arms. Right into his arms. And so, that's my challenge, is carve out the time to tell him your story and to let him love you at the end of it. Because there's something about being known and still being loved that changes everything.
So as we close, just ask that you stand, and we're going to sing. If you're going to grab the piece of paper. And this song is called Run to the Father, and it's so appropriate to sing this song because that's what Andy is talking about. And it is, I know Jessica and Michaels and James and I, the leadership of this church, our heart is that each and every one of you learn to hear God's voice, that you spend time with him, that you learn to connect with him, that you learn to hear his voice. And so I echo his challenge is that this week, even today, before you go to bed, that you would sit down on a piece of paper or on a laptop like I do and ask God a question and just listen and let him speak to you. So as we close with this worship song, I pray even now that you would hear his voice. So Father God, I thank you so much, God, for how you have worked in Andy and Amy's lives. But God, just like you work in their lives, you work in ours. You love us, and you want to strip away every lie, every hindrance, every distraction, God, until we know at the core of our being, God, that we can't work our way out of being flawed, God. We can't work our way out of getting better, but we just simply need to surrender to you and open up our hearts to receive your love. So even as we close with this song, God, speak clearly to our hearts, God, and may our hearts and our minds be open to what you're saying in Jesus' name.